The Dart, the missile with a man in it, the Widowmaker. All these titles have been applied to an iconic aircraft built by the Lockheed Corporation. It was notorious for being a difficult jet to fly and for how many pilots it took down with it. But is there more to the stubby-winged jet than we give it credit for? Was it really that bad?
God damn it, Mr.
Alright, you're gonna have to hear me out on this one. I'm gonna be that guy and stand up for the F-104 starfighter and what it contributed to aviation history. I'm not gonna pretend it's the best thing ever, but believe me, there's more to it than meets the eye. I'm Falcon, and today I want to cover the hows and whys of the F-104 starfighter. To really understand the story of the plane the internet loves to hate, we have to discuss its designer, Clarence Kelly Johnson. Johnson had been the chief designer of the Lockheed Aircraft Corporation since 1938, with notable creations including the P-38 Lightning and the P-80 Shooting Star, the first jet fighter widely adopted by the Army Air Force at the tail end of World War II. Calling Kelly a visionary is a bit of an understatement. As he helmed the Lockheed Skunk Works, the company's advanced development department, he envisioned some pretty crazy shit in addition to the world-famous planes that actually materialized. For example, what would become the P-80 was originally dubbed the L-133. The 133 was a radical design, especially for 1940. Intended to be propelled by two L-1000 turbojets, this was a whole year before British inventor Frank Whittle would complete the first practical jet engines accessible to the Allies. It featured a unique canard arrangement and a fuselage that blended into the wing for more efficient airflow. And again, I want to emphasize, this is back in 1940, before the Gloucester Meteor and the Me-262. And hell, we weren't even in World War II yet. The US Army, of course, saw it as too radical, hence the creation of the more conventional P-80 later in the war. So that gives us an idea of what Johnson had buzzing around in his head. Let's fast forward to the Korean conflict. Johnson spent some time in Korea talking with fighter pilots about their experiences and their desires for future combat aircraft. You see, in the early jet age, fighters were tangling not at 20 to 25,000 feet as they were in World War II, but sometimes pushing up to 10,000 feet higher. With the higher altitude also came higher speeds. While the F-86 Sabre maintained a positive kill ratio over the Soviet-built MiG-15, the cruel truth is that the lighter and smaller MiG had a higher top speed and rate of climb. Sure, the F-86 could catch a MiG in a dive and our pilots' superior training gave them an edge, but Johnson took the deficiencies to heart as he moved to design what was intended to be America's next premier day fighter. With that, I do want to mention there were two schools of thought in fighter design at the time. Day fighters like the Sabre and F-9F Cougar, and more complex all-weather interceptors like the F-3D Skyknight and the F-102 Delta Dagger. Now that's a gross oversimplification of a very complex topic, but it isn't like now where one multi-role aircraft can fight at any time of day in any conditions. Day fighters centered tactics around dogfighting visually, typically with guns and short-range missiles, and used their crude radars for ranging their guns and the like. All-weather aircraft relied heavily on radars to search and track enemy aircraft, but typically were not suited for dogfighting. Again, an oversimplification, but for all intents and purposes, Kelly Johnson's next design was intended as a day fighter with an emphasis on speed and high-altitude performance to kill other enemy fighters. By 1952, Johnson presented his concept to the Air Force, who took great interest in the project. The proposal saw competition in the form of North American, Republican Northrop, but Lockheed's L-246 design was selected. Following Lockheed's convention of including stellar entities and aircraft titles such as the Shooting Star or Constellation, the L-246 was dubbed Starfighter. Allocated the designation F-104 by the Air Force, the Starfighter was built on information gained from the X-3 and X-7 test aircraft. Hundreds of artillery rockets were also employed to test various flight surface configurations. In the end, Skunk Works settled on an unusual trapezoidal wing canted downward to help with horizontal stability. Unlike other aircraft of the day, which stored fuel in internal wing tanks, the F-104's wings were extremely thin and effectively were bolted to the side of the aircraft. Also breaking the mold was its T-tail configuration, which was found to offer better control at transonic speeds. The narrow and long design of the aircraft looked like no other. It was made to simply stab through the air as fast as possible. A tight turning radius with extreme nose authority wasn't seen as important as maintaining energy in a high-altitude dogfight. The starfighter's claim to fame was outclassing Soviet fighters on speed and high-altitude performance. Although, while its turning circle was wide because of the aircraft's light weight and high wing loading, the 104 could maintain high-speed turns surprisingly well. As long as it could stay fast, the starfighter was to be a lethal opponent. Of course, to get fast and stay fast, you need a hell of a power plant. The newly designed General Electric J79 turbojet was slated to do the job. The 79 was a massive motor, spitting out over 15,000 pounds of thrust with afterburner. In an effort to satiate Korean War pilots' requests for improved firepower, the starfighter was fitted with a 20mm Gatling cannon known as the Vulcan. The first of its kind fitted to a fighter, the Vulcan was superior to traditional machine guns in almost every way. The gun itself, which featured 6 barrels linked together, weighed only 300 pounds without ammunition. And given the gun was externally driven, it was almost impervious to jamming. Any unfired round or jammed casing would simply be spat out of the mechanism to make way for the next one. You want a flying gun? Move over A-10. The F-104 was the original flying buzzsaw. As it neared completion, the starfighter was set to be the ultimate MiG killer, able to outclimb, outrun, and outshoot any of the MiGs in the Korean conflict. Unfortunately, things were about to get complicated. As the F-104 was taking its first flights, technology was rapidly advancing. The US Air Force was starting to look at missiles as a primary air-to-air weapon. In particular, the AIM-9 Sidewinder was coming onto scene, and the F-104 was upgraded to accommodate the new missile. And sure, that really wasn't a problem. I mean, new tools are good. As long as the starfighter could maintain its original MiG-killing mission, everything would turn out just fine. Say hello to new multi-mission requirements. The Air Force also wanted the starfighter to fill the bomber intercept job, which meant accommodating the massive Air 2 Genie air-to-air nuclear rocket. Yeah, you heard me right. Anti-bomber doctrine of the early 50s saw unguided rockets taking the place of guns on most all-weather interceptors. Everything from small 2-inch folding fin rockets to literal nuclear-tipped rockets were applied. The starfighter, with its thin, long fuselage, was not the ideal platform for Genie rocket employment. The Genie required a large launch platform lest the massive rocket motor burn away the jet's aluminum belly. A solution came in the form of a trapeze launcher that would sling the rocket down several feet to clear the aircraft. Only then would the rocket charge fire and throw the nuke down range, ideally to burst within the formation of bombers. As the mission changed, other competitors built from the start as interceptors like the F-102 were quickly catching the Air Force's eye. To them, the idea of a day fighter was becoming less and less important by the day. Regardless, the F-104A starfighter was accepted into Air Force service on February 20th, 1958. The US Air Force would become just one of many operators of the starfighter. Let's delve into that next. As Lockheed was unable to corner the US Air Force market with the starfighter, they turned to America's allies who were in need of a modern but relatively low-cost fighter. In 1957, the West German Luftwaffe was still trying to resurrect itself after a complete and total destruction by the Allies in World War II. With the threat of the Iron Curtain on its doorstep, the Luftwaffe sought out a modern, ready-to-go fighter to take on every duty from interception to ground attack. The needs of the Luftwaffe were presented to Lockheed, who stepped forward with their multi-role F-104G concept. The G model would include the following changes: a more powerful J79-11A engine, a larger tail also applied to the American F-104B and C for improved horizontal stability and control, improved flaps for better low-speed maneuverability, a larger drag chute to shorten landing distances, de-icing equipment for engine inlets, improved avionics including a new radar and inertial navigation system, and finally, the means to carry 3,000 pounds of external stores. Competing with the F-104 were the prototype English Electric P-1, which would later evolve into the Lightning, an upgraded F-11F Super Tiger from the Grumman Aircraft Corporation, the new Vought F-8U Crusader, and finally the Republic F-105 Thundersheet fighter bomber. Now, for a time, even the Saunders-Roe SR-177 rocket-assisted interceptor concept was a possibility, but that was written off pretty early in the competition. In the end, the F-104G was selected as all of the other competitors were still in development. The F-104 was basically ready to go from the outset. Germany wasn't the only nation to pick up the F-104G. Belgium, the Netherlands, and Italy also signed on to purchase the G. Including Germany, each nation would also manufacture the starfighter indigenously under license. The F-104G was quickly becoming the go-to platform for NATO members. And while Lockheed's new fighter was left by the wayside in the US, the international market was quickly making up for their earlier shortcomings. Soon after, Taiwan, Japan, and Pakistan, among others, would also get behind the 104. Even Canada would produce their own starfighter, the CF-104, in the mid-60s. Now, most of you know what would happen next. A lot of starfighters crashed. Germany in particular suffered extremely high losses through the 1960s. Going over the Luftwaffe losses, I found that a good number of them are related to pilot error, be it contact with the ground during attack runs, losing control on landing, or departing control at altitude. The F-104 was designed for experienced American fighter pilots who, for some, had been flying since the early 1940s, all the way through World War II in Korea. The German Luftwaffe was built from the ground up as recently as 1956, full of rookie pilots whose only jet experience were very short stints in the more conventional aircraft like the F-86. Flying the starfighter brought with it many challenges. As I said before, the F-104 could maintain turns well. But unlike today's fighters that can maintain high angles of attack, the starfighter would easily lose control if the nose pulled too hard off its plane of motion. Angle of attack is, in layman's term, the angle at which the nose of the aircraft points away from the direction of flight. Modern aircraft can hold angles of attack in a turn from 30 to 40 and even sometimes 50 plus degrees. The F-104 was simply not built to do this, and if the angle of attack exceeded 15 degrees, the aircraft could violently pitch up and snap into an often unrecoverable spin. The disorienting pitch up and departure was extremely harsh on the pilots, who would often be unable to inject in time before hitting the ground if they were too low. Such accidents occurred during ground attack training, where if a student pilot got too low, they might accidentally yank the stick in an attempt to pull out. Even if a pilot was able to eject in time, the Lockheed C2 ejection seat, again more suited to high altitude use, wouldn't allow for a full parachute before the pilot hit the ground. The C2 was an older seat designed based on the original F-104's downward firing system. Yeah, you heard that right. The original firing seat didn't last too long for obvious reasons. Anyway, the C2 was not what we know as a 0-0 seat, requiring forward motion and altitude to get a pilot out. A 0-0 seat like the Martin Baker Mark 7 is rocket-propelled and can safely deliver an airman under parachute while a plane is still on the ramp, parked. Another F-104 unpleasantry was its high landing speed. Due to its stubby wings, the starfighter had to come in for landing at around 175 knots in ideal conditions. For reference, that's only 15 miles faster than its stall speed, making for a narrow margin of error for an inexperienced pilot. Again, ejecting that low with the old C2 seat was not ideal. With 67 Luftwaffe F-104 losses by 1966, the German media labeled the F-104 as a Widowmaker. There were claims that the aircraft itself was unsafe and unsuitable for a modern air force. The new commander of the Luftwaffe in 1966, Johann Steinhoff, ordered all F-104s in German service to be grounded until a solution could be investigated. Steinhoff was a World War II flying ace, with 149 victories against the Soviets and 19 against Western powers. His World War II career was cut short when he crashed his Me-262 on landing and suffered severe burns over most of his body. Upon investigating the causes of starfighter crashes, Steinhoff determined that the F-104 was relatively sound. However, German pilots were not adequately trained as their American or Italian counterparts. Steinhoff initiated a new training regimen which drastically reduced fatality rates. To address the ejection issue, the Martin Baker Mark 7 was installed, which further improved survivability. Even so, the German public still had a bad taste in their mouths regarding the starfighter, and media being media continued to perpetuate the idea that the F-104 was a death trap, a label that still haunts the starfighter community. Canada also suffered an extremely high loss rate. At the end of its 24-year service, the RCAF lost 113 starfighters, almost half of their own 238-built Canadian F-104s. However, it is important to note that the Royal Canadian Air Force losses were, like with Luftwaffe, mostly due to pilot error and other outside factors like bird strikes. And now, a Canadian Goose is going to absolutely wreak havoc on an Orenda J-79, just saying. Also to note, the starfighter's predecessor in Canadian service, the F-86 Sabre, suffered over 282 losses and 113 pilots killed, almost double the loss of RCAF's starfighters in just a 12-year period. Now this might sound like a whataboutism, but I think it just highlights how hazardous the conditions over Canada are for all aircraft in general. Interestingly, the CF-104s were the most high-hour starfighters in the world. At the time of retirement in the early 1980s, the average CF-104 had around 6,000 hours of flight time on it, versus 2,000 hours for similar German F-104Gs. Now, not to poke too hard at Canada, but overflying their aircraft seems to be an ongoing trend even today. Canada, just let your legacy Hornets rest, please. Often glossed over by starfighter detractors is its actual effectiveness in combat, rare as it was. The US Air Force used the F-104 as a great deterrent over Taiwan during the 1958 Taiwan Strait crisis. With the 104s making Mach 2 runs up and down the strait, the Red Chinese never challenged the F-104s with their MiG-15s and 17s. The Taiwanese Air Force, impressed with the starfighters' abilities, purchased several F-104Cs for their own interception duties. On January 13, 1967, two starfighters piloted by Major Hu Xinlin and Captain Shi Beipo each scored a kill against a formation of PLAF MiG-19 farmers. While one F-104 from the Force ship ended up being listed as missing in action, the dogfight would prove that the stubby-winged dart of a jet could draw blood. 2 years prior, in the skies over India and Pakistan, starfighters of the newly formed Pakistani Air Force would frequently tangle with the Indian Air Force's finest. On September 3, 1965, F-104As, nicknamed Griffins by the Pakistanis, were vectored to support a flight of F-86s that had been jumped by 6 Indian fallen Nats. Flight Officer Abbas Mirza of 9 Squadron and the lead Griffin rolled into the melee from 36,000 feet. One of the Nat pilots reportedly cried, as the attack on the Sabres was foiled, a second F-104 piloted by Flight Lieutenant Kam Durrani singled out one of the Nats and forced it to land in Pakistani territory. Its pilot was then swiftly captured. 4 days later, on September 7th, an Indian Air Force Dassault Mystère piloted by Commander Ajamata Davaya tangled with a 104 crewed by Amjad Khan. While Khan's initial Sidewinder shot missed, a burst of cannon fire shredded Davaya's Mystère. Instead of ejecting, Davaya broke into the oncoming starfighter and collided with it, only to then lose control and crash. Davaya was killed instantly. Khan, unable to maintain control of his now damaged F-104, was forced to eject. The starfighter would later go on to claim a Canberra bomber. There, I said it right this time, Animarchy. And the F-104's victories would add to the Pakistani Air Force's kill ratio of 6-1 against India in the Indo-Pakistani War of 1965. The Vietnam conflict saw the Air Force employ the F-104 primarily as a bomber escort. There, it didn't perform as well as the Pakistani or Taiwanese F-104 counterparts. As I discussed in my F-4 video, American pilots had neglected to train in air-to-air combat by the mid-60s. As such, when the F-104 was deployed to Vietnam and it faced the newer generations of MiGs like the MiG-19 and 21, American pilots were caught lacking. No starfighter victories were recorded, while at the same time, one F-104 piloted by Captain Philip Eldon Smith of the 479th Tactical Fighter Wing was shot down by Chinese Air Force MiG-19 cannon fire. He would bail out over the water only to be captured by a Chinese fishing vessel. Smith would end up being the only American airman to be a guest of the Chinese government during Vietnam. The American 104s would ultimately be ineffective, and 7 other starfighters would be lost to ground fire. 2 would even collide during a combat air patrol in an attempt to recover Smith. As the F-4 Phantom was gaining popularity in tactical air command, all starfighters were transferred to the Air National Guard by 1967, never to see combat for the US Air Force ever again. There's a veil of darkness in the Lockheed bid to disperse the F-104 that I've neglected to cover until now. In 1976, after an audit of Lockheed's spending, it was discovered that $22 million had allegedly been spent in bribes to foreign officials in an attempt to garner sales for the starfighter. I won't go too deep into this as it is a very complex issue, but as an example, West German Minister Franz Josef Strauss allegedly received $10 million from Lockheed in 1961 to influence his purchase. Strauss denied the allegations brought up by former Lockheed employee Ernest Hauser, but when asked to present the documents detailing the starfighter deal by the German government, they were found to have been destroyed in 1962. Pretty suspicious, I don't know. I won't doubt that the F-104 is a controversial aircraft. On one hand, it revolutionized how aircraft can be dispersed to allies and build international military strength, but on the other hand, it highlighted the dangers of taking a purpose-built machine and forcing it into other roles, as well as cementing the importance of pilot training the world over. If you want my opinion, using the F-104 as a ground attack platform is basically trying to eat soup with a fork. Now despite that, the idea of the F-104 becoming a worldwide export fighter laid the carpet for later aircraft to be dispersed in a similar but more efficient manner, like the F-5 and F-16. Not only was the F-104 a valuable step in fighter aircraft evolution, it would go on to be an indispensable research platform. NASA used the 104 to great effect for everything from an X-15 chase plane to mounting heat-resistant tiles for the space shuttle. A few F-104s were also modified for high-altitude training and research for the US Air Force's astronaut school. Dubbed NF-104As, the custom starfighter was fitted with a rocket motor to push it past 100,000 feet, where RCS thrusters on the nose and wings would take over to control the aircraft. The F-104 was not a perfect fighter, nor was it necessarily even great, but hyperbolic memes and concept albums are all derived from a basic misunderstanding of what a complex tale the F-104 itself was really just a cog in. And honestly, I really don't blame people for looking at the F-104 at face value. Once a reputation is applied en masse, be it true or not, it's hard to shake it. The average aviation enthusiast who isn't as hyper-focused as I would easily take the shit as they see without looking into the whys or hows. The aforementioned scandal helped the uninformed media push through the idea that the F-104 was an intentionally poorly designed export interceptor to line its designers' wallets, which in my opinion just isn't really the case. That label goes with the MiG-23, but I have plans for that fucking thing. The F-104 was not initially intended to be an export aircraft, and was the culmination of years of research in an ever-changing world of air combat. While innovative, the ins and outs of US Air Force doctrine changed before it had a chance to truly shine. Even so, many nations still ended up loving the F-104. Italy, for example, kept it flying until just 20 years ago in 2004, constantly upgrading it with newer avionics and weapons. Hell, they even got AIM-7 Sparrows working on it. Japan operated the F-104 from 1962 to 1986, all the while losing only 3 aircraft during its career. Their indigenous variant, the F-104J, was well liked by Japanese pilots who operated the aircraft in its original fighter role, while at the same time operating other aircraft types for dangerous ground attack and maritime strike missions. Speaking of countries with low starfighter loss rates, Spain never lost a single of their 21 starfighters, which served their air force well into the 1970s. Love it or hate it, the Widowmaker is a media nickname for the starfighter. No pilot wants to fly a Widowmaker, and thus they never referred to it as such. Less grim names were created by the pilots. The Dart, the Missile, Echo meaning glory, Badmash meaning the wicked one, and the Zipper, my personal favorite, were much more common among the pilots who put their lives on the line when they strapped on the F-104. I guess at the end of all of this, I want to leave you with the following. There's always another side to history, be it about the F-104 or aviation in general. Hell, I might have even gotten something wrong in this, of course, and if so, please leave a comment so I can learn something. Do your own research too, read some books, and come to your own conclusions. Keep that sun at your back now. Now then. Oh, Laser Pig, Laser Pig. I want you to repeat after me. Kelly Johnson did nothing wrong.
Okay, fine. Look, it's a decent plane. I changed my mind, okay? Look, we're friends here. We'll make a video together on it. It'll be fun. Let's not do anything too hastily, okay?
Is that the first season of Sex and the City on Blu-ray?
Hell yeah, that Samantha's a queen.
Okay, I'm in.